Okay, so welcome to this presentation on the musculoskeletal system and implications for special populations. This forms a fairly short section of your assessment workbook, and so I'm going to go through a few key points with you. What I'm going to do with this session, rather than me sort of go through everything in great detail and you sort of listen in for an hour, I'm going to kind of chuck it at you a little bit. So what I'd like you to do first of all is really just sort of step away from the presentation, and I want you to, well, you can pause this or sort of screenshot the questions, but I need you to go away and come up with the answers for whatever's on the screen here. So I've got 8 questions that I want you to consider as you read through. So a bit like a comprehension exercise. So you're going to read through, it's page 55 of the Fitness Instructor Manual, or if this is subsequently updated, it's the section regarding musculoskeletal system and implications for special populations. So I'm going to get you to pause in a second and then go away and come up with the answers for that. Okay, so pause now. So hopefully you've managed to pause and have done things properly and gone away and done your reading, because there's not really much input from me. So I'll go through the answers. I hope you found the workbook relatively useful and quite interesting. And we'll go through the answers now. So the hormone responsible for boys' increased muscle growth is testosterone. So one of the things that comes across in the manual is really the idea that actually, in terms of sort of size and weight, boys and girls don't differ wildly until we really start to see the changes associated with puberty, and particularly the influence of testosterone on young men is really a critical point at which muscle mass starts to develop. It also has quite a positive effect on bone mass, and we start to see sort of bodily changes in both sexes. So we asked the question, one of those bodily changes is that girls lay down proportionally more body fat than boys. Again, this is partly due to the effects of estrogen or the absence of testosterone, and essentially the normal healthy body fat percentage of females is greater than males because of the supportive role it plays in childbearing. So when do boys experience their greatest growth spurt? Is between 14 and 15 years, which is just a little bit later than you see in girls. So sometimes you'll see a slight sort of mismatch in the height of girls and boys, and girls will almost begin to sort of outstrip the boys in terms of height. One of the things that causes this growth is the longitudinal growth of bone. So if we think of bone, it can grow widthways and it can grow longitudinally. So these growth spurts, are seen. We see this really sort of quite marked longitudinal growth in bone, and the whole thing doesn't just expand. What we see is actually this layer of cartilage at the ends of each bone, just below the joint line, is where the bone grows. So it starts life as cartilage, it ossifies, the next level up starts to create cartilage, it ossifies, i.e. turns into bone, and then moves up and moves up and moves up. So the growth plates are made of cartilage, and this is why things like fractures are very serious, or can be potentially very serious in young people, particularly if they interrupt the growth plate. So if a fracture that crosses the growth plate could have potential to mean that one or that affected bone doesn't grow at the required rate. So if you think you've broken the growth plate of your right tibia, you might find that the right tibia grows less than the left tibia. So you could end up with a slight imbalance in that situation. Not always. Well, none of us are completely symmetrical anyway, but it has potential to do that. So the most common site of growth plate fracture is in the wrist, and this is just a sort of probably largely due to just its vulnerability. So I think anyway the wrist is one of the more common sites of fracture, so it stands to reason that growth plate fractures are going to occur there more often than anywhere else. I guess in terms of sort of the implications, it's useful to show that actually wrist injuries in young people you need to be particularly careful of, and maybe don't be shy about referring people to A&E if you sort of see on field or on pitch accidents where people are sort of clutching their wrist and struggling to kind of grasp and move. So why might adolescents be at greater risk of muscle tears? Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. I mean, in terms of the numbers, I couldn't tell if they're at greater risk than particular other groups. Young people, you have a young body that is pliable and flexible. You do have some people that experience periods of muscle pain as bones grow longitudinally, and the muscle tissue seems to be relatively stretched. So it's almost like it takes a while for the sort of protein elements and the collagen elements to kind of catch up with that sort of accelerated bone growth. So you may start to see muscle tears associated with that longitudinal growth of bone, and the rate at which the muscle is sort of are kind of developing to reach that same length is slightly lags behind. And we start to see this coordination suffering in young people as you sometimes see young people, they come back from the summer holidays and they seem to have grown spent their time in a grow bag, and quite often the big thing that changes the leg growth seems to grow disproportionately compared to the rest of the body. So you sometimes get people, you see it in young kids sometimes, that you see them running sometimes and you think, what's moving in what direction? There seems to be a sort of mismatch in coordination, particularly as we see those years around the growth spurt, where people are almost kind of changing their sort of movement patterns to accommodate these new length limbs. So people will sometimes start to see coordination suffer. So from a gym perspective, it's useful to maybe consider, if you're training young people, to consider if they do have those fundamental movement patterns of things like sort of squatting or pressing, pushing, and whether actually you might need to kind of relearn some of those patterns. So this picture just summarizes some key changes. So the manual has some really nice ideas about the sort of categories of things that we need to be aware of in young people. So I'm going to kind of leave it in your hands to cover most of the work, but I'll just emphasize a couple of points here. If we see on this picture on the right hand side of this developing bone, what you can see here is the stage of bone growth. Now, as a fetus, your bones are essentially collagen. So collagen is not soft, but it has a degree of softness to it. And what you are as a tiny little fetus that's sort of growing is essentially you're a collagen model of a skeleton. Now, as you as a fetus develop, that collagen starts to ossify. So collagen becomes kind of mineralized with calcium, and so you start to get these harder bony growths. You can see in that second picture just under here, you can see you get like a little collar of bone around the outside, and the inside begins to ossify. So that third picture, can you see how the blood vessel has perforated that collar? So this is still taking place when you are a fetus, but this stimulates the point at which you start to assemble the skeleton that that means you're kind of ready to enter the outside world. So what you can see is, can you see the ends? You get these what are called ossification centres. So we've got an area at the end of the bone that begins to ossify, and we've also got that sort of collar around the middle which is ossifying. So when you're born, your bones are still kind of largely in that state. So they're relatively soft. So we had a sort of a little puppy come into our lives a few months ago, and one of the things you're advised is to not sort of run them into the ground in the sort of early weeks of their life. You've got to really sort of monitor how much exercise you give them, because their little bones are exactly like that. They have blobs of cartilage at the end that if you work them too hard, the cartilage sort of moves and starts to get sort of disformed. So in the early stages of life, your bone gradually completes that ossification process. So what you end up with over the first few months, first year really, is a bone that looks a little bit more like this one on the right hand side. But there's an important couple of things it's an important thing that remains. You can see now at the end we've got articular cartilage. So this is forming the ends of the bone, and this is where it will fit into synovial joints. So we looked at synovial joints. We saw that cartilage sort of slides against other articular cartilage, and this is a much sort of harder, shinier type of cartilage. Now, the other type of cartilage we've got is the cartilage that forms this what we call epiphyseal plate. And can you see how we've got one of these plates at either end of the bone? So we've got one down there and one at the top. There we go. So that is where your bone grows longitudinally. So when your bone grows, the cartilage becomes ossified and moves along. Another layer of cartilage is formed gradually and gradually. So as cartilage is formed, it gradually ossifies at the back. So it will kind of ossify at this region. I'm just colouring in here, and it will begin creating new cells in this region. I'm just covering in blue. So you sort of get a longitudinal growth either side. So young people still have a degree of softness to their bones. So there's a couple of conditions related to this. You might have heard of a condition called Osgood-Schlatter's. So Osgood-Schlatter's is particularly common in young people who play a lot of football, a lot of kicking, and here the quadricep tendon pulls on a softened area of bone, and it creates a sort of inflammation at the front of the knee. There's also a condition called Sever's disease. So Sever's is where the same sort of process, the Achilles tendon pulls on the back of the heel, and where that bone is still quite soft, it creates sort of inflammation and pain. And so the growth plates are one of the reasons that we maybe exercise caution when using large weights with young people. I think the evidence is a little bit mixed about damages of excessive weight training, but we try and sort of progress load in a very controlled manner when we're dealing with young people. Because if you start, loading people with sort of 2-3 times their body weight squatting, there's potential to disrupt the position and the health of these growth plates. So, in terms of the other stuff on this slide, on the left hand side I've just got a picture that shows relative body weights of young people. So you can see, let's just pick some random weights. So let's have a look at the differences when people are 7 years old. Let's have a look at when they're 10 years old. Let's have a look at when they're 13 years old, and let's have a look at when they're 16 years old. So just have a look down, see if you can see what differences there are between the weight of each group. So what you can see is young boys and girls at 7, there's very little in it really, isn't there? An extra pound, so sort of 500 grams or so as an average. At 10, again, very little in it. 13, we actually see girls start to be slightly heavier as they've got that early spurt. And then at 16, you can see boys have really started to catch up, and actually a little bit earlier than that, sort of certainly 14, 15, 16, you start to see boys really accelerate in terms of their mass. So a lot of this is coming from muscle mass. A lot of it is coming from bone mass as well, and so this is an important consideration, particularly when sort of matching groups in young people. You know, maybe if you've got a group of young tennis players or something, they're okay to be matched quite young, but maybe we start to consider how we integrate groups as we go later in the age groups. So in terms of the things you're going to be asked to write about, you'll asked to be able to comment on muscle mass, which has got an association with the testosterone levels. Body fat, we see girls increase the amount of body fat around puberty. There's also a note in your manual about activity levels in girls, and there is definitely a link between the girls' drop off in activity levels, certainly around puberty and post-puberty, and I think it's an area that we really need to sort of work on to develop more sort of active habits in young girls. That's not to say that all boys are sort of active. The implications of the growth spurts, so we particularly in terms of things like coordination and muscle injuries. The effect that has on flexibility, just as muscles struggle to catch up with that bone growth, and related to that is these changes in limb length and the effect that has on coordination. So there's lots of things you can add about the changes between these age groups. So let's have a look at a quick writing frame I've got put together here. So here I've got a writing frame. I'm not going to talk through it. I'll just let you have a look over it. But essentially, I want you to consider each of these components when you're explaining the section on 14 to 16-year-olds. So starting by just a really brief description, say that actually when we're a fetus, we're essentially a sort of cartilage model, and then through the early years of life, that cartilage ossifies. You're then going on to explain that many of the larger physical changes in adolescence occur after puberty. And then really, if you follow my writing frame here, you'll really address everything that's needed by that assessment. So I'm going to leave that up there. I would suggest you pause the presentation. You can have a go at completing your workbook now, or you can go back and complete it later. So if you want to keep that up here, just pause it. Otherwise, I'll press on. So this is a really difficult section to cover. The section on antenatal and postnatal women. Again, I'm sort of sticking it back on you to a certain extent. So I want to go away, read page 59 of your manual, or if it's subsequently updated, the section on pre and postnatal, or sort of antenatal and postnatal women. And I want you to answer those 3 questions. What is relaxin? What postural changes occur as a result of pregnancy? And what precautions would you take post-pregnancy? So I pause the presentation, and we'll pick that up in a short while. Okay, so hopefully you paused, and you've had a look over your 3 questions and had a good dig into that work. So you'll get a sense that it's a much sort of bigger topic than we have time for. But I think what's really being looked for is to show your understanding of the need to be mindful of these clients. Now, if you wish to work with more pregnant women or women around pregnancy, there are specific courses related to providing exercise and nutrition advice for pre and postnatal women. So once you've completed your level 3, that's quite a nice branch to go down. Certainly gives you a lot of confidence to work with those client groups, because it can be quite scary. So the questions are, what is relaxin? So relaxin is a hormone that's released actually quite early on in pregnancy. If we look at the picture on here, you can see there's quite profound bodily changes that need to occur to allow the woman's body to accommodate that growing fetus. So one of the things that particularly happens is the pelvis will kind of almost broaden to accommodate the fetus. Now, to allow this to happen, relaxin works on every ligament in the body, and so it kind of causes a relaxation of those collagen fibers. So whilst it's very functional in the pelvis, it does mean that everywhere else in the body there's a greater potential for short sort of tiny little alterations in posture and joint position. So we try and sort of limit kind of extended stretching, so we don't exacerbate the effects of relaxin. This isn't the time to sort of maybe take up really sort of advanced yoga moves, and we'll try and discourage people kind of making use of this new flexibility and sort of going, wow, look at what I can do now. But essentially we try and limit extreme ranges of movement. What postural changes you can see, obviously this is again it's a difficult one to sort of hone down into a manageable chunk. Your manual has some really good ideas. The key thing that you see is more body weight being held in front of the body. So what you'll see as the fetus grows, it grows out to what we call anteriorly, in front of the body. Now, in terms of the sort of knock-on effect, there's quite a long chain of effects. I'm just going to cover probably just a couple that are useful, and then the rest you can just take from your manual. So number one, we see more body weight in front of that midline of the body. This means that just simple coordination changes. In terms of exercise, the mothers can exercise quite late into pregnancy, and it not have a great deal of effect on the fetus, but it is useful to understand that coordination will change as people adapt to these new sort of postures. A couple of things you see now, as that body weight goes forward, the back almost kind of needs to go that way to counterbalance. So what you end up with is an increase in this curve here called the lumbar lordosis. So that can account for a lot of the back pain, as there's almost that squashing of that lumbar area as you draw the backs of those vertebrae together. So you get an increased lumbar lordosis. You might also see a larger, what we call kyphosis. So it's really the body kind of counterbalancing that extra weight that's held in front of the body. Now, the other thing that changes, if we think about breathing, when we breathe diaphragmatically, our diaphragm at the bottom of our ribs has to drop down and our sort of abdomen goes forward. So we have this nice sort of breath where the diaphragm drops and the abdomen goes out. Now, if I've got a great big baby in the way, then that leaves less space around here for my for my diaphragm to drop down. So you might start to see, particularly in the later stages of pregnancy, that breathing function is slightly decreased, and that has a number of kind of knock-on effects, particularly with respect to how circulation is returned to the heart. So that's kind of responsible for a lot of the sort of blood pooling that you might see in the limbs and the legs of women. But the biggies, I would say, is number one, that weight shift forward, so that anterior weight shift, the fact that it's counterbalanced by that increased lordosis, that increased kyphosis, and then also the effects it has on breathing. Now, the third question asks, what precautions would you take post-pregnancy? And really, a lot of it is related to that sort of presence of relaxin. It seems to remain in the body for a long period of time. So extremes of movement or extremes of range are avoided, and also lurching back into high intensity, sort of particularly sort of heavy dynamic loading, sort of box jumps, that kind of thing, you'd avoid. Part of the reason, again, is also, if we think about what the abdominal muscles have had to do that, they're really stretched. So sometimes they even separate, and as part of that stability mechanism for the spine, that is a really key component. So we need to wait, or train it in a very gentle fashion, very gentle, controlled fashion, before we start really using that slightly more dynamic loading, because the stability mechanisms for the low back can take a while to regain their strength. Also, people have spent a long time in this lordotic position. I've got there, oh, that's a terrible picture, in this lordotic position. So there may need to be a little bit of postural re-education, and work, particularly in the lower abdominals, to try and sort of get that back into position. Okay, so this is a table that you've got in your manuals, and again, this summarizes really nicely the changes that take place. So particularly breaking down into trimesters. So trimester number 1 is 0 to 3 months, trimester 2 is 3 to 6 months, and trimester 3 is up to 6 months, up into birth. So there it covers the physical effects, and also to a certain degree the precautions you need to take when working with these pregnant women. So this is a really good sort of summary of what to include in your little explanation. So here's a quick writing frame. Again, I won't talk you through it. I'll let you do it in your own time. But I sort of think it's worth just establishing at the start, just saying, explain that pregnancy begins with a number of hormonal and musculoskeletal changes, or that should say changes, that you as an instructor need to know about if you're to safely plan exercise. So then you just work through my little frame. So you explain about relaxing, explain postural changes, particularly in stages 2 and 3, and then go on to what your precautions are post-pregnancy. Particularly the biggies. There's lots in that list, but I would consider the biggies to be what I've got there. This idea that there's a weakened pelvic floor, potentially, and also lengthened abdominal muscles. So there's a loss of strength and a loss of stability in that lumbar spine. So we're now just getting on to older people. Again, I'm sticking it on you. So page 57 to 58 in your workbook, or if it subsequently changes, whatever section is on older people. So I would read through that and just have a look at those questions for me now. So what is the difference between osteoporosis and osteopenia, and who suffers osteoporosis more out of men and women, and explain your reasons. And then lastly, what is osteoarthritis? So let's crack on. So I'll let you pause and answer those, and then we'll come back in a second. So pause now. So hopefully you've had a little good look at that, and you can start to get a feel for what that picture is on the top right. So the osteoporosis is where we lose bone mineral density, but we start to see these very specific, almost kind of a porous look to that bone. So can you see in there, if I just highlight a couple of points there, can you see that on the red? And what we've got is bone mineral density being lost, but creating these quite large pockets that look porous, i.e. as if they're if you've got a porous rock, it allows water in. These create big holes which really limit the strength of bone. So the osteopenia is generally just a sort of a loss of bone mineral more density. Bone mineral density more broadly. Osteoporosis is a problem, particularly because of the effect it has on the likelihood of fracture. So common fracture sites, again, the wrist. So particularly in older people, wrist fractures are very common because the bone mineral density is lost, and possibly also because you lack the sort of muscle strength and reactivity to break a fall, so that the skeleton starts absorbing a lot of that shock. Really critical sites. The top of the femur is a really common. So this bone here we've got is a bit like the neck of a femur, and this is so this region here. Do you see how it's a little bit thinner than the one on the left hand side? So where your ball and socket joint is, the bone can break just outside of that ball and socket, and a really serious fracture in older people, and a sign that quite often that osteoporosis is quite advanced. You also can lose height in vertebrae. So vertebrae can almost sort of collapse inward. So quite often when you see people really hunched over, it's because you're starting to actually almost kind of get a sort of crush fracture in vertebrae. So in terms of precautions, we may have clients that are older with that already in place, and we might sort of, we might want to possibly strengthen muscles that may help support that position, but also need to be quite mindful that sometimes bony changes can't be undone. We might want to limit axial loading, i.e. sort of, if I've got someone who's sort of quite sort of frail and quite exposed bony vertebrae, then I'm not going to sort of suddenly load them up with a barbell squat. And also in terms of sort of dynamic jumping and landing, we may want to avoid extremes of that in older people. So the second question, who suffers more? Well, men do suffer from osteoporosis, but women, because of the effects of estrogen and the loss of estrogen as they go around the menopause, it becomes really critical. So estrogen helps maintain bone mineral density, and without it, women, the rate at which they lose bone mineral really starts to accelerate. Osteoarthritis, we have a little picture on the next slide, which I'm going to go through in a minute. So this is osteoarthritis. So what you can see on the left hand side, you've got, this is a knee obviously, you can just see in that cartilage there, you've got an area where it started to erode. So this could be just through loading, it could be through loading on a joint that's been previously injured. So you might have an area which wears excessively, a bit like if the tracking's out on your car, you might have a little bit of your tyre that wears excessively. So what you start to see is that the sites of wear start to increase. And actually what you sometimes see is you almost get like little cysts behind those sites of wear, and it starts to break down the quality of the cartilage, and you start to get little areas of exposed bone underneath now as the cartilage wears away. So you get a little bit more sort of grinding of the bone. And one of the things that happens, I don't know if you can see it well on this, you start to get these bony growths on the edge of those bones. It seems almost as if that inflammation and also the loss of that cartilage starts to create bony deposits on the edge of that joint. So what you'll see in an arthritic joint is often it's much wider. Sometimes arthritic knees, you think, wow, really thick and chunky around the joint, and often the actual bone above is relatively thin. So someone may be losing bone mineral in the sort of neck of the femur, and then actually at the joint is massive, partly because of inflammation, but also because of this bony deposits. So cartilage the cartilage wears and causes joints to inflame, so they get sort of angry and swollen, and then really as a function of this, you start to decrease that mobility. You've got big joints, they don't move as well, and also because people aren't moving quite so well, they start to lose that muscle mass as well. So older people will lose mobility and flexibility. They'll tend to lose muscle mass as well, particularly as we age. Maybe a little bit about the loss of testosterone as well. We lose those type 2 fibers, so those real sort of power fibers, the ones those fast twitch muscle fibers. And we also lose a little bit of bone mass as well, particularly as a result of, well, in men, testosterone, and women, and estrogen. So to finish, we've got this writing frame. And again, I'm not going to talk you through it, but a good start point is to consider that as we age, this is a nice way to start actually, to say as we age, a number of hormonal and musculoskeletal changes occur that we as instructors need to be aware of. So we're not looking for you to write a whole essay on all body changes, but we need to show that you understand that there is a life course, and the musculoskeletal system changes throughout it. So a lot of the information's in your manual, and then if you follow this writing frame, you'll make sure you've got everything included that you need. So just pause that if you want it, or just take a screenshot now. And that's the end. So complete your manual, or your workbook, sorry. Your manual has all the information you need, so hopefully you found that useful, and I'll see your work soon. Okay, thank you very much.